Michael lay awake almost half the night, as he often did now. When he finally fell asleep, he dreamt he was flying. At first, as he leaned into the wind, arms extended like wings, the sensation of the air lifting him was exhilarating. He imagined this was how a bird felt, as light as feathery seeds released from their pods, floating gently on a breeze. He soared upward into the sky, never once fearing he would fall. He flew over treetops and tops, over fields and gardens until his body suddenly curved in an arc and headed toward the earth. Then he saw the man below on the roof, and that was when Michael knew he was not a bird at all. He was, in fact, a bullet. Frantically, he twisted his body to the right, then to the left, but it stayed on course no matter how hard he tried to steer it away. His body began to pick up speed as it headed downward. Faster and faster it streaked toward the unsuspecting man on the roof. Michael tried to scream a warning. He tried to get the man to move, to get out of the way, but no sound came from his burning throat. It was going to happen, and he could do nothing to stop it. Michael managed to wake himself just as the top of his head was about to strike the man's skull. He lay in a damp pool of sweat, barely able to breathe. His heart was pounding so loudly the sound of it filled his ears, blocking out the soft chirping of the crickets. He gripped the edges of his bed and held on until his heart began to quiet and he was able to take a deep breath. He knew this was happening because he had seen Jenna Ward at the pool earlier that day. He had stared across the pool into her face and suddenly realized there would never be any place on earth where he could hide. At first he had wanted to believe that the person dangling her feet in the water merely resembled Jenna Ward. So while he automatically moved his head from side to side, pretending to keep a sharp eye on the swimmers, he studied her from behind the metallic shield of his sunglasses. There could be no doubt. It was Jenna Ward. No one else had eyes like hers. Those eyes had haunted them from the moment he first saw her picture in the newspaper. Until that morning, he had been secure in his belief that the Wards were not members of the community pool. It had never occurred to him that Jenna or her mother might come as someone's guest. But when Jenna had shown up, all he had been able to think about for the rest of the day was how he was going to make it through the summer if she continued to come to the pool. Now, as the cicadas buzzed loudly beneath his window, his mind once again searched in vain for a way out of all this. He thought of quitting his job, but he needed the money. He could look for other work, but it was late in the summer and all the seasonal jobs were already taken. And deep down, he knew working someplace else wouldn't protect him from running into Jenna Ward. She could show up anywhere, anytime. The glare from the street light outside spilled across the lower part of his bed. It was still dark. The air in his room was stifling. Michael glanced over at the digital clock. It was only a little after 3. He knew it was pointless to lie there. He wouldn't be able to sleep. So he kicked aside the damp sheet. And because he usually slept naked on hot, humid nights, he slipped on a pair of boxer shorts. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he was startled by muffled sounds coming from the TV. Someone was up, although the house was completely dark except for the muted light coming from the television screen. He hesitated, worried that it might be his father or mother. They would question him, wonder what he was doing up so late. Finally, he crept into the kitchen. If he was quiet enough, they might not discover he was up. But as he stood in the middle of the dark room, he couldn't think of why he had come there. He wasn't hungry. He didn't want anything to drink. What did he plan to do? Watch television, maybe? But now he couldn't. He thought about going out on the patio. At least it would be cooler outside. But as he reached for the doorknob, the overhead fluorescent light blinked on. Josh stood in the doorway, wearing only his baggy pajama bottoms, his arms folded. Are you sleepwalking? Michael was so stunned by the sudden appearance of the light and then Josh that he merely shook his head and let his hand fall away from the knob. Because if you are, I'm not supposed to wake you. Josh moved cautiously toward his brother. I'm supposed to take your hand and lead you back to bed. I'm awake, Michael told him. You don't act like you're awake. Josh took a step back and studied his brother's face. Where do you think you're going? Outside? In your underwear? Josh rolled his eyes toward the ceiling and made clicking noises with his tongue. The neighbors will think you're a pervert. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, you little dork. Who's going to see me? This whole conversation was ridiculous. Why was he even arguing with Josh? He didn't owe him any explanations. Michael stared down at him. What are you doing up so late, anyway? It's summer. Josh was obviously annoyed that the pressure was now on him. I can stay up as late as I want. Michael noticed his brother was still carrying the remote control. And that's when all the best R-rated movies are on cable, right? In the fluorescent light, it was difficult to tell whether Josh had turned a shade paler, but Michael was sure he had. He nodded at his brother. Right, I figured as much. Josh sat down at the kitchen table and laid the remote in front of him. So what? I like to see naked girls. So what? Michael opened the refrigerator and pulled out a carton of milk. What could he say? He liked to look at naked women too. He wasn't going to be a hypocrite about it. He took a swallow of milk right from the carton. Josh kept watching him, but he didn't say anything. Michael handed him the carton. Josh took a swallow. It was as if they had just made a silent pact and were now sealing it. Michael pulled a package of Oreos from the cupboard and tossed it on the table, then brought out 2 glasses and filled them with milk. For a while, the two of them just sat there, dunking cookies silently until Josh, his teeth speckled with dark crumbs, said suddenly, Hey, did you hear the cops are about to nail Charlie Ward's killer? The lump of white icing Michael had licked off his cookie suddenly stuck in his throat. How do you know that? I heard Dad talking about it with Mr. Eaple next door. Josh looked pleased that he could tell his brother something he didn't know. Mr. Eaple said the cops showed up at the Finley's house 2 blocks over. They were going door to door asking people questions. Michael fought to keep the panic out of his voice. Why this neighborhood? Josh tilted his head to the side and stared up at the ceiling, trying to recall more of the conversation between Mr. Eaple and his father. Well, Mr. Eaple said he heard that the ballistics team had narrowed down the area where the bullet came from to 4 blocks. It was all true then. The nightmare was real. Michael could no longer pretend, as he sometimes did, that there was a chance that he hadn't fired that fateful shot. The bullet had come from somewhere in his neighborhood. The chances of someone else in such a small area shooting off a gun around noon on that same day were probably 1 in a million. He had spent weeks trying to get used to the idea that he had committed this hideous act, but always somewhere there had been hope. A bullet traveling a mile or more through the air could have come from as far away as the next town over. There had always been the outside chance that someone else had fired a gun into the air that 4th of July afternoon. Now that chance no longer existed. Are you saying that our block is one of the 4? Michael's words felt slow and labored. Part of him didn't want the answer to that question. Josh shrugged and reached for another cookie. The cops aren't saying which blocks. He popped the whole cookie into his mouth. Why would they? He said, spraying crumbs as he talked. I mean, geez, nothing like alerting the murderer in case he wants to beat feet or anything. They're just going to show up at your front door and, surprise, he shouted, leaning his body across the table and spitting chocolate crumbs in Michael's face. Michael wanted to punch him right in the mouth, but he had both hands clamped tightly around the sides of his chair, trying to ground himself. Josh narrowed his eyes at his brother. So, been doing any target practice lately? You know, with that rifle Grandpa gave you on your birthday? A snide grin spread across his face. Michael stared him down. Are you trying to say I shot Charlie Ward? Michael was gripping the edge of his chair for dear life, but he managed to keep his voice calm. Each word came out carefully weighted. Josh backed off, aware that he'd gone too far. Hey, I was just kidding. You don't kid about something like that. Not wanting to get himself in any deeper, Josh picked up the remote and headed for the door. Want to come watch TV? Michael knew this was his brother's way of trying to get back on his good side. So after a few minutes had passed, and because he had nowhere else to go, Michael followed Josh into the living room, and for the next 3 hours he stared at the flashing images on the television screen without seeing one single thing.